all their stores, they were the most popular coffee brand in mainland China, but they neglected to trademark their Chinese name. And somebody else had already trademarked Xinbake, and they ended up having to pay millions to get it back.
There is a bit of a safety net if you are a famous international brand, which is difficult to define, but I think everyone would agree that Starbucks probably fits it, which gives you a bit of additional protection. But for most of us, you just need to go out and make your filings in the relevant classifications. And then in terms of the Chinese outbound, again, as you say, it's really important to know who it is you're dealing with. And one of the propositions in the book is that the due diligence is not just there to tell you that somebody is a criminal or something would be illegal if you did it, so don't do it. It's also there to provide you with business intelligence to support your negotiations. Because, without wanting to sort of go into quoting Sun Tzu and the Art of War, the more you know about your counterpart, the better you're going to be able to negotiate a deal that works for you. Now, on the worst case scenario, you find out something that kills the deal. But research from people like Control Risks and Kroll, the big risk management companies operating out there, suggests that only 5 to 10% of deals actually die because of the due diligence findings. In all the other cases, even if you find a problem, you're able to negotiate your way around it. So you reduce the price of the transaction, or you change the model of the deal, or you haggle about it. So at worst, the deal dies, but at best, you gain the business intelligence that allows you to get a good deal. And so you pay for the investment in the due diligence.
But when does business intelligence go too far? When does due diligence go too far? We've had situations like recently with Rio Tinto, where many of their executives were arrested for various accused illegal activities. But they argue that they were simply just doing their business research. Is there a limit to how far you can do your due diligence on business in China?
Absolutely, as there is anywhere. So there's a line that you cross between doing investigative research and stealing or bribing your way into sensitive commercial secrets. And in the case of state-owned enterprises, what might be state secrets, which obviously be much more serious. I think I mentioned before that you can often track the journey from an acceptable activity to one that is no longer going to be acceptable. So we saw that with the GSK example. If you take the example of investigations and personal data and secrets, you can also track that. The Rio Tinto 4 was a famous case where they were accused of bribing people in state-owned enterprises to give them what basically were state secrets and commercially confidential information, which, if it's true that they did this, then they shouldn't have done, and they went to prison for it. So clearly the Chinese courts felt that they were guilty of it. But there's another case that related to, I think it was a bit later than that, to a Dun & Bradstreet joint venture in China, which was basically accused of harvesting personal data and misusing it and selling it on in ways that shouldn't have been done. And about 200 people got arrested for that. And that was a few years before we got to the sort of GSK issue. And one of the fallout pieces of the GSK issue was the arrest of a British investigator called Peter Humphrey in Shanghai, who again was accused of abusing personal data of Chinese citizens. And so you go back to the sort of Rio Tinto 4 and the Dun & Bradstreet case, and you can see that at the same time, around the time of Dun & Bradstreet case, China actually changed some of the laws around personal data privacy. And some of the official media started talking more about protecting data. And so you do have to be aware of these moves, because at the end of the day, you end up with really serious outcomes, like the arrest of the investigator in the GSK case.
So it goes back to your earlier point, talking about that you really need to look at what's going on a policy level, and you need to go what's also going on a judicial level in China and see how the laws are evolving.
5 years ago, 10 years ago, no one would have batted an eyelid at that sort of activity. But the environment has completely changed between now and then. And of course, China has also become much more powerful in terms of its impact in the world economy, and geopolitically as well. So all of these things need to be taken into account.
And so now when companies enter China, they need to be made aware that their China strategy today may work, but they need to actually think about their China strategy for tomorrow and mitigate the risk on that.
I mean, the conclusion in the book, the concluding chapter is called The New Reality. And basically it's about the fact that on one side, as I mentioned at the beginning, China controls the production and increasingly is the key part of the market. So foreign companies are in the middle. They're also caught in a period of slower growth and rising cost, added to which there is increased competition and difficulty in finding really good staff. There's a lot of competition for people. So it's much harder for companies, international companies in China, who for the last 20 years basically sit at their desk and see the charts go up because the economy was just moving so fast and the markets were still so new and everyone was just having a good time and being successful. And if you tripped up, if you lost something, if a deal went south, it didn't really matter because overall you're just moving forwards and upwards. But that's no longer the case. So you're struggling with all those constraints, then on top of that, you have much tighter scrutiny and regulation coming from government, which again increases your environmental compliance costs. It increases your costs across the board. You've got to change your business practices. You've got to, in some cases, completely restructure the way your business works, which is what GSK is doing. So the really fundamental changes, and as you say, looking forward, if you have a factory outside Beijing, everyone knows about the smog and pollution in Beijing, you might have ticked every environmental box and be completely compliant today, but there's nothing to say that in 5 years' time, the government might not say, do you know what, your industry has to move out of this area because it no longer works for the environment. So what we're saying from a due diligence perspective is see what is compliant, but as a big international company that has to be seen to be operating in best practice, you need to go beyond compliance. You need to localize your business, you need to engage with the community, you need to do best practice plus if you're going to really have a long-term future. And for many companies, that means really becoming a Chinese business rather than a foreign business.
Just to bring this back down onto an operational level, without giving too much away from your book, in your book you talk about having a due diligence toolkit for professionals on what they should be looking for and what they shouldn't worry about if it doesn't quite fit in line with how business is done here. I'm just wondering if you could talk us through a couple of the other things that normally, if we found this in a British company, would send off red flags, but that businesses shouldn't necessarily be too worried about with Chinese firms.
In the book, I use an analogy of like going on a trip and using a map to map out your trip. So the first thing is that people need to equip themselves to be able to go on that journey. You need to do your research to understand where the risks are in that journey. So an excellent piece of research would be reading my book, obviously. But there are also lots of online sources, there are lots of books, there are lots of people that you can talk to, just to make yourself aware of the issues. I mean, you go to France, you don't know that people drive on the other side of the road, you look the wrong way, you're going to get run over. But it's a very simple issue. If you get it wrong, it could be literally fatal. So it's about equipping yourself with the information and making sure that you understand where the tools are, what the tools are you need. I mentioned the trademark review. This is something you can do online from your desk in London. The Supreme Court has it's a pilot, but there's an online database you can search for bad credit risks, people who have defaulted on Supreme Court judgments. There is not a whole centralized database of court judgments in China, but there is quite a large one that's a good idea to check if you're looking at something in China,
so it sounds
for
like,
example.
Yeah, so it sounds like there are actually a lot of desk-based resource tools that professionals in the UK and elsewhere can actually gain access to vet things very, very simply.
Yeah, equally, China has an equivalent of the Companies House in the UK, the State Administration of Industry and Commerce,